Yeah, I was just going to say we have these two really different books that have a very similar theme that runs through them both.
Yeah. So Rise of the Red Hand is set in a near future South Asian landscape, and it centers on two teens who are on opposite sides of the tracks. And in this world, the world has been ravaged by World War III and climate change. And these two teens kind of come together to overthrow a fascist government. And it's kind of a fast-paced sci-fi, cli-fi, cyberpunk novel. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And Alone is a middle grade novel, upper middle grade novel that is in many ways a contemporary retelling of the classic children's book Island of the Blue Dolphins. However, in Alone, the main character Maddie arranges a secret sleepover with her two best friends and lies to each of her parents so that they will each think she's with the other. They live separately. And is going to have this secret sleepover with her best friends. And at the last minute, her best friends can't come. And Maddie ends up spending the night alone at her grandparents' house, which is empty. And that happens to be the night when the entire town, in fact, the county, potentially the whole state, she's not sure, is evacuated and she's left behind. And she has to figure out how to survive. And it turns into months and years before there is a resolution to her challenge. So there is a tiny little bit of dystopian edge to it in order to create the context in which something like that could happen. But for the most part, it is a survival adventure novel, and it's told completely in verse. So it's written in poems.
And it's amazing, I should say.
Thank you.
It's the kind of book it's the kind of book that you devour in 2-3 days because you just really just kind of want to keep going, and you're really worried about her and you want to see her make it through the end. So the reason we chose survival as kind of the theme for the evening is because in Megan's world in Alone, this young lady is really out there by herself and trying to basically make it to the next day. And I think all the characters, except for the very wealthy in Rise of the Red Hand, are doing the exact same thing.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, and they're just in just a different kind of way. But in so many ways, science fiction and fantasy is so real. You know, a lot of times we think of it as a place that's, it's in the future. It's so different. And maybe my novel just kind of turned out to be a little too close as we kind of came along into 2020. But yeah, the idea that these children have to survive, I think it's not too far-fetched, really. And I think it's a very real thing. Yeah. It's happening right now. People trying to survive in this world where their lives are being changed by the climate so dramatically and devastated, and so ignored by the larger, powerful groups that can actually help them. So I feel like there's a lot of, she was very much alone in that space, Maddie, and then these characters are actually not alone and yet overlooked. Yeah.
Right.
Having to kind of move to the next day.
Right. And are still isolated and are still have that sense of trying to regain power and the powerlessness of being marginalized. And I'm really curious, when did you sell your book? Was it in 2019?
Gosh, Eric, I don't remember.
You want to phone a friend?
I think this 2020 year has just kind of messed with my,
it's been
my
so
timeline
surreal.
in general. But I conceived
before the pandemic, before COVID. Yeah,
for sure.
Because I'm sure people are asking me, because where I don't necessarily have that strong theme of climate change and climate issues, although that is a question that is raised in her mind when everyone's abandons the town. They aren't sure, she doesn't know why. She's not sure what the imminent threat is that has caused everyone to leave or to be taken. And she wonders if it's climate related or environmentally, if there's an environmental threat that she's not perceiving. And I've been asked, and I'm sure you've been asked, how did you know this was coming? And in my case, it's more around the social distancing and the isolation that people have been experiencing through COVID. But in your case, there are these very real, very clear parallels to the world that you imagined before we hit 2020.
Yeah. Eric said end of 2019, so that's good
Okay.
to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I wrote it the year before that. So, and a lot of the work I did to kind of pull this book together had to do with this trying to understand climate change. I think, I keep coming back to the environment over and over again. It's the thing that keeps me up at night. It's the thing that I'm compelled to be around. I feed my squirrels every morning. Like I'm like, I just, it's a big part of everything that we do. And so I poured over a lot of maps and visualizations, and I studied a lot of things that I could comprehend as a non-scientist, obviously, to understand the impact of climate change now. And it's crazy what's happening. And there are really fascinating groups like futurist groups like Superflux that is basically building these future models about what the world is going to be like. So I kept watching these TED Talks about they could recreate the polluted air in the future if we did not stop the CO2 emissions from certain vehicles. And they created it, and I'm totally misquoting everything. I'm taking it out of context. They created it and they delivered it to world leaders to say, here, this is the air that you're going to have your children breathe. And that compelled a lot of governments to change their policies. So I feel like, how do we take these kind of abstractions? Oh, it's in the future. Oh, this won't happen to me, or even my children won't be impacted. But how do we bring it today? How do we bring these big cultural, social, and climate anxieties and make them real so that we can actually know that we could do something about it? And I think your story also has a lot to do with empathy as well. It's like, what are the connections we're hoping to find with people around us, and why do we need to be with people, in a larger context? So,
Yeah. And who are we when the world that we think we knew, or when the world that we knew is completely turned on its head, right? What is our identity absent the context that we have become comfortable with? And I think that's a huge piece of the climate question, right? Who do we become if we can't use all the creature comforts that we are used to using because of the cost on the toll on the environment and all of that? Those are big questions. They're big, scary questions.
They're big, scary. And the thing is that, I've always hated that feeling of I'm only one person and I can't do anything, because it just drives me nuts, because then we become a complete sea of people who don't do anything. And then we allow the world to become what it is, with the loudest voices and loudest people to make it for us. And that really bothers me. And we have existed and seen that kind of roll out in a different way, in certain ways. But yeah, the climate question is such a big problem that, like, no, one person can't, there's not one solution. There's not one thing that's going to make it all better. And that's the thing to remember. It's everyone every day doing better, doing more, and to actually demanding larger changes from the people who run the show,
So I have a question for you, and this is based on my own personal context. I love that you set your story in Southeast Asia. And part of the reason I love that is because my daughter lives in Singapore, and I've been to visit her twice. And so I had this really vivid visual context for the city that you set your story in. And it wasn't hard. And plus, you talk about watching sort of those futurist maps. I've looked at those where it shows the impact on the rising ocean levels. And, places like Singapore, holy mackerel, right? So it was really easy for me to imagine the story there, but I'm curious what, you could have said it anywhere in the world. You certainly could have said it in something looking like the United States or North America. So tell me a little bit about your thinking about that choice.
Yeah, it's, I think it's very personal. My dad he was born in Pakistan, and he's sick and he came down to India during the partition. So he was 1 year old and he was born in 1946. So he was 1 year old on one of those trains to Pakistan, from Pakistan down. And my grandmother was something like 17 years old. And so they moved into Amritsar and Patiala and kind of went from there. With the reparations from the partition, they built a life. So I've spent my life kind of, my mother's from Latvia, so I'm a double kind of child, a very confused child of two very different immigrants who are both very similar in so many weird ways. It's like, it doesn't matter where you're from. They're all immigrant children are always a little bit like, we feel guilty. I'm not sure why. We got to work hard. But yeah, the India connection in South Asia kind of has always been a place that when I've visited, and the people I know, they're so resilient. Like they're not going down. You know, they know the wave is coming and they've already built the dam themselves. They're not waiting. I mean, there's only so much that they are willing to take from the government, but we all today we see with the problems that are happening with the farmers. But I just always was raised with this idea, okay, the partition of India is a big thing in my mind, and also like the resilience of South Asian and Asian people in general, how they, if you visit there, if you go to New Delhi or any of these other places, you could see, you know, it takes like 5-10 years to get a landline in your house, so you don't wait.
Wow.
Right. And so you get it yourself, and you can see these wires just wrapped around every cable. And it's also like negligence on the government side. People shouldn't have to do that much to get those things. But the people are just so powerfully creative. So I thought, okay, if we set it there, what would it look like? And how would it work? And it also brought up the question of like, is technology going to be the solution, or is nature going to be the solution? And to kind of bring that into context, you know.
Really
What
cool.
about the inspiration for your book? Because I mean, your world is so just wonderful to fall into. The survival kind of narrative has been so beautifully portrayed in your poetry that I feel like, how did you come to that place that I want to tell that story of this young woman surviving? What was the impetus behind that?
You know, it actually came out of a book club meeting that I had with my daughter when she was in middle school. She might have been in 5th or 6th grade. And we were in a mother-daughter book club. And we read Island of the Blue Dolphins. And the girls were, for those of you that don't remember that story, it's based on historical events that took place in Southern California in the 1800s. And Scott Odell, the novelist in the mid-19th century, or in the mid-20th century, he took the few facts that were known from that event and spun them into the novel that became Island of the Blue Dolphins. And it essentially tells the story of a young woman who lives alone on an island off the coast of California for 18 years before she is found and brought to the mainland. And in his story, he invents a reason that her tribe leaves the island, and he invents a reason that she is left behind, that she stays behind. And he creates a whole imaginary life that she lived for 18 years on that island before she was brought to Santa Barbara. And the facts of the real story are not known beyond that she lived there and she was there that long, and then she was brought to the mainland, and the rest of her tribe had either not survived or had scattered, and no one spoke her language. And so she couldn't tell her story before she died. But it's become a classic of children's literature, and it's a classic survival adventure story. But the girls read it and the moms read it, and as we were talking about it, the girls were really fascinated by the fact that this girl can survive on an island by herself for so many years and make a life for herself. And they were really fascinated by the survival aspects of it, you know, finding water and finding food and taming the wild dogs and all of that. And it occurred to me as we were having the discussion that unlike other survival stories like Hatchet, where Brian is literally dropped into a forest and has to figure out this alien environment and find shelter and food and whatnot, or Castaway, one of my favorite films with Tom Hanks and Wilson on the island. Unlike those stories, Island of the Blue Dolphins, the character there, she has to figure out how to survive alone on her own, in her own home. the island is not alien to her. It's the only home she's ever known, and she's very comfortable there. There are aspects of it that she has to learn and master, and there are challenges that it presents, but it's not this foreign environment that so many survival stories take place in. And I said to the girls in that meeting, imagine if you were left alone, if you were left behind, if you came home from school tomorrow and there was nobody there, the whole town had left and you were left behind, what would you do? How would you survive? And I couldn't get that story, that idea for a story out of my head. And that's where it came from. And that's why it's set in Colorado, is because I spent 10 years looking around Colorado, imagining what it would be like to be 10 or 11 or 12. I made her 12 in the beginning of the story, and have to figure it out. And of course, I took away things like the power grid and technology, and I had to make it as hard for her as I could, or there's no story. But that's really where it came from. And I think that's why it appeals to so many kids, because there's this tantalizing idea of, ooh, if I were the only one here, what could I do? And where would I go? And what opportunities might I avail myself of? But then there's this also really frightening idea of, oh my gosh, what would I do if I were completely alone? And that duality, I think, is really compelling and appeals to a lot of people. So that's where it came from.
It's like our deepest, darkest anxiety. I have I have a 6-year-old, and during this pandemic, poor thing, he's so usually well adjusted and cheerful and happy, and he is still that way, but he's terrified that we're going to be gone. And it's just like the world has changed. You see half faces everywhere, and it must be this really kind of dark anxiety that we all have being alone, and your book does it. Like, here we are there, and you worked out the cell phone thing so quickly. So that was like, you can't even, there's nothing, you cannot talk. And then what do you do? And you're left alone with yourself. And can you, and a dog.
Yes.
George.
Thank you for
having
her
a pet.
Rottweiler. Yeah.